The alien girl ordered him to kneel, so why is she holding onto his shirt like that? He stands motionless, the dim lights of the ruined corridor casting jagged shadows across the debris-strewn floor. Her presence is a living force pressing against him, the glow of her markings pulsing through the smoky air. He senses the heat of her gaze, something sharper than fear twisting low in his gut. For 3 pounding heartbeats, neither moves nor speaks. Then her lip curls into the faintest hint of a smirk, and she closes the distance with a deliberate, predatory grace. "Kneel," she says, her voice sliding across the narrow space like a blade. There is command in that single word, a metallic edge that dares him to defy her. He doesn't answer. His jaw tightens, and the scar on his cheek twitches with tension. The battered plating of his armor still clings to him, a testament to the firefight they just survived. Smoke drifts between them, and for an instant, he imagines ignoring her. But the golden shimmer in her eyes, like liquid fire, warns him that defiance might be lethal. He drops one knee to the fractured floor, though not in total surrender. It's a deliberate, unbroken stare he gives her, a silent vow that he will not be cowed, no matter how low she forces him. And she sees it. She steps closer, laying a hand against his shoulder with a surprising gentleness that belies her command. Her curved horns cast an eerie silhouette on the wall behind them. He notices the faint hum emanating from her, a subsonic vibration that tingles in his ears. This, he thinks, must be how she exerts her influence. But the flicker in her bioluminescent markings suggests uncertainty, or perhaps curiosity. She's breathing more quickly now, each exhalation making the intricate lines on her face surge with a pale luminescence. Slowly, the tension uncoils from him, though not by choice. Whatever advantage she holds, it's something he cannot fully resist. His name is Dane, but he doesn't speak it yet. He wonders if she has a name that can be spoken in human language, or if it sounds more like music that can cut steel. She tightens her grip, pushing him the rest of the way down so that both knees hit the floor. His chest heaves as he struggles to resist the primal urge to fight back. His gaze flits to her slender collarbones, to the swirl of alien lines that move across her skin whenever her heart thunders. She is beautiful in a way that alarms him. No, more than that, her allure is not something comforting or soft. There is something razor-edged in the way she stands. And then she speaks again quietly, each word felt in the pit of his stomach. "When I tell you to kneel," she murmurs, "you will not hesitate." Her tone is regal, dangerous. His mind floods with the memory of how they arrived here, an ambush in the loading bay, charred steel and spent plasma cartridges littering the ground. Gunfire had ripped through his squad. He was the only one left standing at the end, battered and half-blinded by the swirling dust. And from the smoke emerged this creature, Cerevia, he would later learn, like a vengeful deity. She had all but forced him into retreat, each movement an expert dance of lethal intent. And in the final seconds of their clash, when sparks flew from the short-circuiting lights, she pinned him against the hull plating, one clawed hand pressing into his chest armor. She spoke her demand, and for a moment, the shock of it rooted him to the ground. That was minutes ago, or hours. Time felt warped since the entire corridor collapsed in an explosion behind them, trapping them both inside. Now they are here, alone, locked in a standoff where either can escape without the other's help. He rises slowly from his forced kneel, still keeping his hands away from his sidearm. He's not an idiot. She might kill him if he makes a move. But then she does something strange. Her grip on his shirt does not release. She tugs him closer, eyes flickering, her breath ragged. He tastes the metallic tang of leftover smoke on the air between them. She holds him there as though not quite prepared to let him go. "What do you want?" he finally asks, voice rough from the dust he's inhaled. Even as he speaks, his heart is still racing with the after-effects of combat, and there's a pang of something he can't name. The line of her jaw tightens, as if she's wrestling with some internal calculation. For a creature who just demanded his submission, she's hesitating, and he can't help but notice how her eyes dart to his chest, as though measuring his heartbeat. Her response is clipped, almost a hiss. "We are trapped, you and I. You'll do as I say, or either of us gets out of here alive. He lets a slow exhale slip through his teeth, feeling that old, familiar wave of defiance burn in his veins. Being told what to do is not something he takes kindly to, but he also senses that she speaks the truth. The corridor behind them is sealed with twisted metal, sparking wires, and structural beams. Their only way forward is deeper into the facility's labyrinth of half-collapsed tunnels. Alone, either might survive. Together, their chances improve, if they don't kill each other first. He grips her wrist, not to pry it off but just enough to establish that he won't be led around like a docile prisoner. Her eyes snap to where his fingers press against her skin, and in the faint golden glow of her markings, he sees her surprise. She expected him to be more compliant, perhaps. She doesn't jerk away, which surprises him in turn. Their breath mingles, shallow and tense, and he notices a subtle shift in her expression. For a heartbeat, a sliver of confusion passes over her features. Then, as if catching herself, her voice goes flinty again. "You have no idea what's out there." "Maybe not," he replies, his words coming out in an arid whisper. "But I know what's in here." He tightens his grip for emphasis. She looks at him, unblinking, her pupils dilating. He refuses to be the first to break eye contact. The silence between them crackles with unspoken fury and an undercurrent of something else. Finally, she steps back, slipping her arm out of his grasp. Her movements are lithe, an economy of motion that tells him she's used to lethal efficiency. She doesn't say another word, but the tension thrums. They begin to move forward, stumbling across beams and fractured plating. More than once, the floor shifts under their combined weight, threatening to plunge them into unknown depths. A side corridor flickers with emergency lighting, painting their path in a hellish red glow. Sarivia lifts a hand, pressing her palm to a sealed hatch. The circuits embedded in her skin briefly glow brighter, as if she can sense the electromagnetic locks. She frowns. "The system's fused. We'll have to find another path." He stands behind her, scanning for alternative routes. His training rears up, methodical and cold, and he wonders if she's reading his heartbeat the way she seems to read the environment. If so, she might catch the small surge of relief that she's not going to kill him outright. At least, not yet. He shoulders a dented steel door. It groans, refusing to budge. She joins him, and together they apply force, the metal straining until it yields with a tortured squeal. A wave of dust hits them, forcing them to shield their faces. He's aware of her closeness in the enclosed space. Their arms brush, and it feels like an electric jolt travels through him. She must feel it too. She steps away, eyes narrowing as if in self-reproach. He doesn't acknowledge it. They peer into the newly opened passage, a maintenance tunnel half filled with debris. It's cramped, and he'll have to hunch to fit through. She leads the way, her slender frame gliding between the twisted rebar. He follows, wincing each time the ceiling scrapes his back. They move in silence, each footstep echoing ominously. The air feels slightly cooler here, a sign they might be moving toward an exit. His pulse steadies, but remains elevated. When she finally speaks, her tone is hushed, as if she's loath to show anything akin to courtesy. "Human, do you have a name?" The question seems purely practical, but there's a flicker of curiosity in her voice. He almost doesn't want to give it, but withholding might antagonize her further. "Dane," he says flatly. He sees how her body stiffens at the sound, the golden lines across her collarbones brightening in a pattern that might be intrigue. She glances back. "Sarivia. That is what your tongue can call me." There's a pause, as if she's about to say something else, but she doesn't. Instead, she steps deeper into the gloom, forcing him to keep pace. He can't help but notice the rhythmic pulse of light along her spine, a subtle glow in the darkness. They progress in tense silence, but it's no longer a silence born of immediate hostility. The tension feels different, cautious, assessing. They're both searching for weaknesses and alliances at the same time. They reach a bend in the tunnel where collapsed piping blocks their way. Water seeps through cracks, forming puddles that reflect the flickering emergency light from above. The stench of stale chemicals clogs his nostrils. Sarivia kneels, running a hand over the surface of the pipe. He notices the slight tremble in her fingers, though she's quick to mask it. Perhaps she's more fatigued than she lets on. Without speaking, he moves to help clear a path, pushing aside broken pieces of metal. She watches him warily, but doesn't protest. Together, they create a narrow opening. Sarivia slides through first, her horns scraping against the edge of the pipe with a metallic rasp. He follows, his broad shoulders making it a tighter squeeze. His combat vest snags, forcing him to yank it free with a grunt. On the other side, the space is marginally wider, an old storage area with toppled shelves and crates. Shattered glass crunches underfoot, and a single flickering overhead lamp casts everything in a sickly white. He sees Sarivia testing the edges of a sealed doorway with her fingertips, her glowing patterns flaring as if she's scanning for energy sources. She suddenly snaps her hand back, shaking it as though electrocuted. He moves closer. "You all right?" His question surprises even him. Why does he care? But she doesn't look at him. She nods once, brushing him off. Then, from the darkness, a metallic screech echoes. Instinct has Dane raising his sidearm, and Sarivia's shoulders tense. Something is in here with them, something more than just wreckage. He points his weapon at the gloom, heart pounding. A shape skitters across the top of a fallen vent, too fast and too shadowy to identify. He glances at Sarivia. She's pressed her back against the crates, her eyes scanning for movement. He wonders if she can sense its heat signature. A crash near the far corner sends bits of debris clattering across the floor. He and Sarivia move in tandem, circling around, weapons drawn, his a pistol, hers the lethal curve of her claws glowing faintly at the tips. There is no spoken coordination, but they flow as if they've done this before, some primal synergy bridging the gap between them. The creature lunges without warning, baring rows of curved teeth. Its exoskeleton glints in the flickering lamp, and it shrieks, a sound so piercing he has to grit his teeth against it. Sarivia's reflexes are lightning fast. She darts in low, raking her claws across its flank. Sparks fly as if she's striking metal. The beast howls and swipes back. Dane fires 2 shots, the muzzle flash lighting up the room, but the bullets ricochet off a segmented plate on its back. He sidesteps its thrashing tail, wincing as the spiked tip slams into the crate next to him, splintering wood. Sarivia leaps clear over the creature with an athletic grace that leaves him momentarily stunned. She lands behind it, sinking her claws into a joint near the neck. It rears back, screeching again. Dane seizes the opening. He lunges forward, jamming the barrel of his pistol between 2 plates of exoskeleton along the beast's side. He fires point blank. The shot is deafening, and this time, the creature's screech warps into a wet gargle. It collapses with a heavy thud, its spine tail twitching in a final spasm. Both of them stand there, panting in the echoing aftermath. Dust swirls in the stale air, and the overhead light flickers again. Sarivia's luminous markings flash in rapid succession, betraying the surge of adrenaline coursing through her. Dane draws a shaky breath, adrenaline pumping so hard his legs feel unsteady. Their gazes meet, and in that moment, the faint tension they felt earlier flares into something more complicated: disbelief, relief, maybe respect. He wants to say something biting, to reassert the hardness that's gotten him this far, but the words don't come. He just nods at her, a brief, harsh dip of the head. She inclines her own, acknowledging his role in the kill. Then she steps away, leaning against a nearby wall. He sees the way her chest rises and falls, sees a faint shimmer of sweat along her collarbones. She drags a hand across her forehead, and the trailing lines of light fade slowly. For the first time, she looks almost tired. If he were a kinderman, he might offer help, but he's not sure she'd accept. Instead, he just stands guard, his eyes scanning the darkness for any more surprises. A crackle from the overhead speaker startles them both. The facility's broken communications system must still have partial power. Static blast, then a voice, distorted and barely recognizable. "All personnel evac, infiltration." The words are garbled. Sarivia stiffens, then looks at him. Her expression is guarded, but there's something else there. He flicks the safety on his weapon, then pushes away from the crates. "We'd better move," he says. She gives a curt nod, and they head deeper into the corridors, forced to rely on each other to survive what lurks within. As they pass through a series of creaking hallways, Dane's mind turns to the vendetta that led him here. He remembers the pinned-down mission, the betrayal that cost his entire squad their lives. The intel had suggested an alliance between certain human factions and an alien force, leading to a coordinated ambush. Anger roils in his gut. Sarivia might have answers. She's clearly not some random operative. But the time for questions will come later, if they even make it out alive. He notices how she keeps her distance now, though her stance is less hostile than before. He catches glimpses of the injuries she's sustained, small cuts, bruises forming along the ridges of her ribs. She doesn't complain, and he respects that, even if he doesn't trust her yet. They emerge into a larger chamber littered with broken observation consoles. The overhead panels flicker, revealing ominous shapes on the walls, like the place was once some kind of research lab. Glass tubes are overturned, sticky residue pooling around shattered flasks. Sarivia steps gingerly, her horns nearly brushing a sagging support beam. Her gaze flickers from side to side, scanning for threats. Dane does the same, though he can't resist glancing at her from time to time, watching how her markings shift in the gloom. He doesn't want to dwell on the strange pull he feels whenever he stands too close to her. The memory of her breath on his neck, the hum of her voice when she commanded him to kneel, it all churns in the back of his mind. They don't speak, but the tension between them is palpable, filling the silence like static electricity. Occasionally, their eyes meet, and for a fraction of a second, it's as if they're locked in another standoff, one fueled not by immediate hostility but by something deep and raw. He pushes the thought away, survival first, anything else second. Approaching the far end of the chamber, they find the exit blocked by what looks like a makeshift barricade. Stacks of crates, metal plating welded into place. It'll take time to clear, and that's time they might not have if more creatures roam these halls. Still, they have no choice. He moves to one side of the barricade, gestures for her to watch his back. She moves fluidly, scanning the darkness while he pries at a gap. As he hauls aside a broken crate, he notices her shifting closer, possibly for better vantage. Her arm brushes his. He feels her warmth even through his armor. It's disconcerting. He doesn't flinch, but he's very aware of her presence in a way he's never been aware of anyone else. Her alien physiology, the unearthly grace, the quiet but lethal confidence, it's like standing next to a loaded weapon with a hair trigger. A sudden clang rings from across the chamber. They both pivot, weapons ready, hearts pounding. But it's just a chunk of ceiling collapsing under its own weight. The tension remains, though. They share a look, no words necessary. They go back to the barricade. He grips the next section of fused metal plating, and she helps with a pull that surprises him in its strength. Together, they manage to pry open a small passage, just wide enough for them to slip through. He gestures for her to go first. For a moment, she hesitates, her eyes flicking over him with suspicion. He almost laughs. Maybe she thinks he'll push the barricade shut behind her. But eventually, she nods and eases through, horns scraping the edges. He follows, carefully wedging his broad shoulders through until they pop free on the other side. They find themselves in a sublevel corridor that slopes downward. The air here is cooler, a draft hinting at an exit. The lighting is sporadic, small pockets of illumination broken by stretches of total darkness. She glances back at him, as though to gauge if he's going to comment on how she's leading. He remains silent, letting her take point. He can't see her face, but the way her head tilts slightly suggests a private smirk. They move on, step by step, the corridor echoing with each footfall. He's used to silence in combat. Stealth operations require minimal chatter. But this silence feels different. It's charged, coiled tight as a spring. Memories of that moment she ordered him to kneel flash in his mind. He recalls the brush of her hand at his collar, the faint tremor in her breath. She's dangerous, unpredictable, lethal. And yet there's something between them that he can't name or deny. He sets his jaw, reminding himself to stay focused. Soon, they come upon a partially open blast door. Beyond it, the corridor ends in a collapsed tunnel. Rubble blocks any straightforward exit. She lets out a sharp breath, frustration evident, though she tries to hide it. Her markings pulse, and he notices they shift hue in tandem with her emotional state. He wonders if she hates how transparent her physiology can be. He steps forward, searching for a side passage. A faint glimmer draws his attention to the corner, near a control panel. Wires dangle, spitting sparks. He nudges them aside with his pistol. Behind them is a ladder, leading down into a service hatch. He glances at her. Might be the only way. She examines the narrow shaft. It drops into darkness, the ladder's rungs caked with rust. Without warning, she slings herself over the edge and begins descending. He scoffs under his breath, grudgingly admiring her nerve. He follows, each rung vibrating under their combined weight. It's a tense journey downward, each step creaking. The ladder shudders ominously about 20 feet in, but they keep going. By the time they reach the bottom, both are layered in sweat and dust. The sublevel corridor below is slightly flooded, a few inches of stagnant water lapping at their boots. A distant hum resonates through the floor, like a generator struggling to stay online. She raises a hand, motioning for him to be still. They stand there, side by side in the water, listening to the rhythmic throbbing of machinery somewhere in the depths. He's never felt more aware of another person's presence. Every inch of her body is just a hair's breadth away, her hand brushing his arm. He can feel her tension, sense the coiled readiness in her posture. She's prepared to spring at the slightest hint of a threat. Suddenly, the overhead lights flicker to life, painfully bright after so much darkness. He squints, hearing Sarivia hiss softly, shielding her eyes with a forearm. The corridor extends in front of them, metal walls dripping with condensation. A sign, half-rusted, reads, "Subreactor Maintenance." Maybe from a time when this place was fully operational, bustling with engineers who never imagined it would become a battlefield. He tries the door on the left. It's locked, a digital panel flickering with error codes. Sarivia moves to the right, dragging her fingers along the seam of another door. Her markings flare, and a faint electric crackling is heard as she manipulates the circuit. With a soft click, the door slides open a few inches, then grinds to a halt. She shoulders it the rest of the way, forcing it open. He steps inside behind her, gun raised. The room is filled with tall servers, blinking lights, and cables snaking across the floor. Cold air blasts from a vent above, sending goosebumps across his arms. He hears her exhale in relief. Perhaps the temperature soothes her. The tension in her shoulders eases, if only slightly. Now that there's a momentary lull, he can't stop his eyes from drifting over her silhouette. Every line of her body seems engineered for lethal grace. At the same time, there's a subtle vulnerability in the way she breathes. She glances over her shoulder, catching him looking. For a split second, their gazes lock, and the air between them feels thick, heavy with the unspoken. His throat tightens. She opens her mouth, perhaps to speak, but closes it again. He can't decide if he's relieved or disappointed. Instead, he moves toward the nearest console, scanning the flickering readouts in a language he half recognizes. He's searching for a blueprint, a route to an exit, anything that might show them a path out of this labyrinth. She stands behind him, close enough that he can feel her warmth through his battered armor. He finds something, a partial map. The console squeals with static as it attempts to compile the data. She leans in, her horns nearly brushing his temple. He can feel the subtle vibration of her voice as she reads off the alien symbols. Their arms nearly touch, and he's aware of her every breath. Focus, he tells himself, ignoring the slow churn of heat in his abdomen. The map shows a route from this sublevel up to an emergency evac zone. If they can navigate the collapsed corridors and bypass any hazards, they might have a way out. Sarivia points to a section of the map, a glowing red outline. "Sealed hatch," she says. "We might be able to override it." He nods, wiping sweat from his brow. "Let's see if we can fix that generator hum we heard. Might restore enough power to open it." She doesn't waste breath agreeing. They step away from the console, scanning the room for a path to the subreactor. He notices the slight hitch in her movements, perhaps a lingering injury from earlier battles. Still, she doesn't complain, and he doesn't offer sympathy. The alliance is pragmatic, built on necessity. They slip back into the corridor, using a small service door at the far end that leads into a cramped maintenance duct. This time, she follows him, her breathing close to his ear. The space is too tight for comfort. Every step, their bodies brush. He forces himself not to think about the strange friction that's building between them. The duct ends at a sealed bulkhead. She tries to work her alien trick again, pressing her palm to the panel. A flare of golden light, then a fizzled spark. She curses softly. He senses the frustration pouring off her. Without a word, she steps aside, letting him pry at the emergency release lever. It yields after a few solid pulls, and the door slides open with a squeal of rusted gears. The subreactor chamber is massive, with catwalks circling a central core that emits an eerie orange glow. Steam hisses from pressure valves, and the entire place vibrates with a low-level hum. He crosses to a control console, scanning the readouts. Sarivia circles the chamber, checking for threats. He sees how her posture is always prepared for a fight, her claws half extended. She glances at him expectantly, as if to say, "Well?" He punches a few commands into the console, trying to reroute power to the evac corridor. The machine sputters, lights flickering overhead. It's going to take a minute to cycle. He curses under his breath. Suddenly, a deep reverberation shakes the entire chamber. The central reactor pulses with an angry light, and an alarm klaxon starts wailing. He works the console feverishly, trying to stabilize the meltdown. She rushes over, scanning the screens. "The coolant system is failing," she says. He shakes his head. "We need to vent the excess, or we won't get out of here alive." She points to a series of valves on the far wall. Without waiting, they sprint toward them, water sloshing underfoot. They start turning the massive wheels, each requiring more strength than expected. She strains, her lean muscles tensing as she twists the jammed valve. He pries another one loose, feeling the vibration intensify. The overhead lights surge, then dim, and for a moment, he thinks the meltdown will be unstoppable. Finally, the valves open with a hiss, a rush of superheated steam escaping through overhead vents. The alarms fall silent, replaced by a steady hum that indicates the reactor is stabilizing. Breathing hard, they slump against the wall, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Their eyes lock again, and he finds it impossible to tear his gaze away from her parted lips, from the fierce glow of her eyes. She's panting, droplets of sweat tracing the lines of her markings, and he's just as disheveled. For a moment, the dire circumstances that forced them together fade into the background. He quickly kills that line of thought, pushing off the wall. "Let's see if that rerouted enough power," he says, voice harsher than intended. She watches him intently, her expression unreadable. They return to the main console. The meltdown alarm is silent, and the display shows partial power restored to the evac corridor. With any luck, that sealed hatch on the map might now be accessible. He opens his mouth to tell her, but the ground suddenly trembles, reminding them there's no time for calm. They hurry back through the corridors, guided by flickering lights that were previously dark. The water in the sublevel remains stagnant, but the overhead flickers guide them to the reactivated door. He can feel the tension rising again, not just from the danger but from her presence. He notices how her breathing remains elevated, how the color in her markings keeps shifting. He forces himself to focus on the mission, on survival. The door in front of them slides open with a reluctant grind. Beyond lies another corridor, narrower but better lit. They step inside, and the door seals behind them. She scans the area, then gestures for him to follow. "Up ahead," she says, her tone clipped. They turn a corner, and the corridor opens into a wide space where scaffolding lines the walls. A grated walkway extends to a large metal hatch, presumably the evac route. She goes first, stepping onto the walkway. It rattles under her weight, and she pauses, testing it. He moves behind her, scanning for potential collapse. She edges closer to the hatch, pressing her hand to its panel. It flashes green, a hiss of released pressure. Success. They share a look of fleeting triumph. Then the floor beneath them vibrates again. He whips his head around, scanning for threats. At the far end of the walkway, a drooling maw emerges from behind the scaffolding. Another monstrous creature, bigger than the last, dragging itself along with spined limbs. Sarivia curses under her breath, stepping back onto the grate. The beast hisses, lunging forward, black eyes glinting. He lifts his pistol, but Sarivia is faster, leaping to intercept. The walkway shakes dangerously under their combined movements. She slashes at its face, drawing sparks and black ichor. The creature shrieks, tail whipping overhead. Dane fires a burst of rounds, but it's heavily armored, deflecting most of the shots. Sarivia darts in again, hooking her claws beneath a plate near its underbelly. She heaves, and with a metallic snap, pries it loose. Dane seizes the opening, jamming his weapon in and firing point blank. The beast convulses, but in its death throes, it thrashes wildly, striking the scaffolding. Metal groans, bolts pop. The walkway begins to buckle. They scramble for balance, the creature's weight tearing a section of steel free. In seconds, the entire structure tilts, sending them sliding toward the edge. He grabs a horizontal bar, stifling a cry as the metal bites into his palms. She clutches at the grate, her horns scraping along the railing. With a snapping sound, part of the walkway tears away, plummeting into the darkness below. The monster's carcass goes with it, leaving them clinging to a precarious ledge. The hatch is only a few feet away, but the walkway is no longer stable. Panting, he looks at her, and she looks back, her markings flickering with tension. He braces himself, extends one hand. "Grab on," he says, voice straining with the effort of holding on. She hesitates only a fraction of a second before reaching for him. Their fingers clasp, and together they pull themselves onto the remaining section of scaffolding. He feels the trembling in her grip, exhaustion, adrenaline, maybe something else. She braces against the wall, breathing ragged. Then, in one fluid motion, she lunges for the hatch panel, slamming her hand against it. It slides open, and beyond, a faint light filters in, fresh air beckoning. He doesn't wait for an invitation. He helps her through the opening, then climbs in after. They collapse onto solid ground, the hatch sealing behind them with a hiss. For the first time, they can both breathe without the acrid stench of fuel and debris. A corridor stretches out, leading to what appears to be a reinforced bay door. No immediate signs of hostiles. They lie there for a moment, panting, side by side. The harsh overhead lights cast shadows that dance across her features. He watches her parted lips as she fights to catch her breath. She turns her head, meeting his gaze with a look that crackles with tension. He realizes how close they are, practically pressed together. She doesn't pull away. Neither does he. He becomes acutely aware of her body heat, of the slow pulse of light along her collarbones that seems to match her pounding heart. The fight-or-flight urgency of combat has always amplified his senses, but this is different. There's a rawness to it that tightens his chest. He can still feel the echo of her command in the corridors, "Kneel." And though he hates the idea of submission, there's a flicker of memory, her grip on his shirt, the strange softness in her eyes. His breath hitches. She sees something in his expression, and her own gaze darkens, the corners of her mouth turning up in an almost defiant smirk. The tension between them is thick enough to taste. But neither moves. Neither speaks. They're caught in a suspended moment, hearts pounding, adrenaline still surging. A slow, grinding noise from the bay door snaps them out of it. They both leap to their feet, ignoring the throbbing aches and bruises. He raises his weapon, she flexes her claws. The door edges open, revealing not a monstrous creature, but a heavily armed patrol of humans in battered armor, obviously survivors of some faction that's been holed up here. Instinctively, he places himself slightly in front of Sarivia, uncertain how they'll react to her. The patrol sees them, and for a moment, nobody shoots. Then a voice calls out, "Lower your weapons!" Tension crackles in the air. He hesitates, glancing at Sarivia. She narrows her eyes, but she doesn't strike. Neither does he. He takes a slow step forward, weapon lowered but not holstered. We don't want trouble, he says, voice steady. The soldier at the front of the patrol barks a mirthless laugh. Looks like you found plenty anyway. Rifles remain trained on them, but no one fires. Sarivia's posture is coiled, ready to pounce. He can see the distrust in the soldier's eyes as they take in the sight of her horns, her alien markings. He steels himself, ready to speak on her behalf, even though an hour ago she was ordering him to kneel at her feet. The soldier's gaze flicks to Sarivia, then back to him. This place is about to go up in flames. We're leaving. He senses an offer in those words. We can help you, he replies, though he isn't entirely sure. Sarivia remains silent, but he can practically feel her tension. The soldier gestures with his rifle for them to move forward. He glances back at Sarivia. She meets his gaze with a silent question. Are we trusting these people? He gives a barely perceptible nod. They don't have much choice. Slowly, they approach the patrol, weapons lowered. Another soldier steps aside, letting them pass. They enter what appears to be a makeshift command post, half the monitors cracked, scorch marks on the walls. The soldier in charge, a grim-faced woman with a shaved head, folds her arms. She eyes Sarivia with open suspicion. Alien? She asks, spitting the word like a curse. Sarivia lifts her chin, returning the glare. Dane clears his throat. We've both been fighting to survive this hellhole. She's not your enemy right now. The woman looks unconvinced but doesn't push it. Instead, she points to a large screen flickering with red warnings. The meltdown you stabilized was just one of several. This facility is coming down. We have a transport topside, but no guarantee it's still operational. He exhales, the weight of the day pressing on him. Then let's move, he says. Sarivia's gaze flicks to him, then back to the soldier. She still doesn't speak, which might be wise given the tension. The soldier nods curtly. Fine. But your friend so much as twitches wrong, she's dead. Sarivia's markings flare, but she holds her tongue. Dane gives her a look that says, keep it together. She smirks, an edge of danger in her expression. Together, they follow the patrol down a winding corridor, passing more battered survivors. He notices they seem to have been here for days, maybe weeks, fending off the same horrors. The deeper they go, the more it becomes clear these humans had once allied with the facility's operators. Now, they're just trying to escape the nightmares unleashed by experimental technology and lethal alien creatures. He lingers near Sarivia, close enough to sense the subtle shift of her breathing. She's on high alert, scanning everything. He catches her eye once, reading the question there, are these truly your people? He doesn't answer out loud, but his grim expression says enough. Soon, they reach a large cargo elevator, flickering overhead lights barely illuminating the scarred metal interior. The soldiers' team piles in. Sarivia and Dane stand to one side, pressed close by the crowd of armored figures. He's never been fond of cramped spaces with too many weapons pointed in his direction. He can sense her tension, too, as though the closeness of so many armed humans is more off-putting than the monstrous creatures they fought together. The elevator jolts, grinding upward. Sparks fly from damaged cables. Alarms beep sporadically. Every shudder makes him wonder if they'll plunge back into the darkness. He feels Sarivia's hand brush his side, and he's not sure if it's by accident or an unconscious gesture of reassurance. Either way, his pulse quickens. Aware of the watchful eyes around them, he keeps his expression neutral, as if her touch means nothing. The elevator lurches to a stop, and the doors groan open. Sunlight floods in, a blinding, raw brilliance after so many hours in the facility's bowels. They step out onto cracked concrete. A ruined compound stretches before them, tall walls partially collapsed. Smoke rises in pillars from distant fires. The sky is pale with ash, and a battered dropship sits listing on a landing pad near the far corner. He steels himself, scanning the perimeter. Movement catches his eye, a pack of the same monstrous creatures prowling near the walls. The soldier with the shaved head curses, ordering her people into defensive formation. Dane raises his pistol, checking the ammo count. Sarivia flexes her claws. They exchange a look, time for one more fight. The survivors sprint toward the dropship. The creatures, sensing easy prey, surge forward with chittering cries. Gunfire erupts. Sarivia lets out a fierce snarl, leaping into the fray. Dane is right behind her, flipping from target to target. Bullets ricochet off hardened shells, but the creatures are weaker at the joints. Dane aims carefully, while Sarivia goes for close combat, her alien strength and speed a blur of lethal motion. The air is alive with the stench of cordite and the screech of dying beasts. People scream, but the survivors press forward. Gradually, they fight their way to the landing pad. The pilot, a gaunt man with a bandaged arm, is already starting the engines. Metal plates rattle, smoke belches from the thrusters. Two creatures manage to fling themselves onto the craft. Dane and Sarivia move in sync. He fires a burst at one's legs, crippling it. She vaults onto the wing, driving her claws into the other's skull before it can tear the hull apart. It drops away with a sickening thud. The pilot hollers for them to board, but the craft is too full. The soldier with the shaved head waves the remainder of her squad on, then turns to Dane and Sarivia. "We can't fit everyone," she says, voice raw. "We'll circle back for you, if we can." A fleeting moment of silence passes. Sarivia's eyes narrow, uncertain. Dane glances at the perimeter. More creatures scuttle along the walls. The soldier clenches her teeth. "Stay alive. We'll do what we can." With that, the dropship lurches off the pad, engines roaring. The battered survivors cling to the side, leaving him, Sarivia, and a handful of others behind. So much for their easy escape. Gunfire erupts again, the stragglers desperately fending off the approaching swarm. The battered old walls won't hold for long. Dane sweeps his gaze across the compound, noticing a breach in the perimeter. Beyond it stretches a wasteland dotted with twisted metal remains of collapsed towers. Smoke rises from countless fires. But it's open ground, a chance to run. He barks orders at the handful of survivors. "We move! Now!" Sarivia is already at the front, tearing through a smaller beast that tries to block their path. She meets his eyes, and in that moment, he knows they'll fight side by side again, even if they'd barely learned to trust each other. They surge through the breach. The creatures scramble behind them, an unholy chorus of screeches. One leaps from a broken segment of wall, tackling a survivor. The man cries out, rifle spinning away. Sarivia doesn't hesitate. She twists mid-run and slashes the beast across the throat, black ichor spraying the ground. Dane hauls the wounded man to his feet, ignoring the terror in his eyes. They press onward, each step agony. The wind outside the compound is thick with ash, but at least the open space gives them some maneuvering room. The creatures follow, but not as aggressively as before. Maybe they're territorial, or maybe they sense easier prey inside. Either way, the group manages to put distance between themselves and the facility. Finally, they collapse behind a rusted hull of a downed transport for cover. Heartbeats thunder, lungs burn. The small band of survivors, maybe 5 besides Dane and Sarivia, gather in a ragged circle. One woman can't stop trembling, tears tracking through the grime on her face. Another man clutches a bleeding arm. Dane glances at Sarivia. She's crouched, shoulders heaving. Their eyes meet for a moment, and he can't ignore the relief flooding him that she's still alive. She's looking at him, too, and something in her expression shifts, respect, maybe gratitude. Her markings glow faintly, a soft impulse. Then, just as quickly, she looks away, as if remembering she can't appear too vulnerable. He checks his ammo. Down to a single clip. The others look similarly spent. For a moment, everything is quiet but for the crackling fires and distant roars from monstrous creatures. The facility behind them collapses in on itself, a deafening rumble that sends a tremor through the ground. Black smoke towers into the sky, blotting out what remains of the sun. In that darkness, they are alone. No sign of the dropship. No rescue. Just each other. One of the survivors, an older man with a hacking cough, clutches his side. We can't stay out here, he rasps. Dane nods, scanning the horizon. In the distance, through the haze, he spots a faint silhouette, possibly an abandoned structure or vehicle. Anywhere would be better than this open graveyard. He points. We move again, quietly. Sarivia doesn't contradict him, though she eyes the distant shapes warily. She stands, flicking black ichor off her claws. He sees her bite down on a wince. She must be in pain, but she hides it well. They trek across the rubble-strewn wasteland, the survivors leaning on each other when needed. The creatures don't pursue in large numbers, only a few stragglers that keep to the shadows. Any that come too close are swiftly dealt with. He notices that, despite the wariness between them, Sarivia is the one who moves to protect the slower survivors first. She's swift, lethal, unstoppable. He fights alongside her, each confrontation a brief but intense clash. Step by step, they approach the shape on the horizon, an overturned crawler vehicle, half buried in the dust. The hull is mostly intact, battered but potentially salvageable for shelter. Relief flickers among the small group. They squeeze through a twisted opening in the side, finding the interior cramped but defensible. Collapsed seats, broken monitors, the smell of stale air. It'll do. Sarivia crouches in a corner, close enough that he can hear her labored breathing. He moves to the other side of the vehicle, scanning the survivors. They look like they're at the end of their rope, dirty, exhausted, half in shock. No one has the energy to talk, let alone argue. In that silence, an unspoken question lingers. What now? He tries to push away the swirl of thoughts about betrayal, about the squad he lost, about the uneasy alliance with an alien he hardly knows. But the memories are insistent. He also can't ignore the steady awareness he has of Sarivia. Even from across the small crawler, he senses her presence like a gravitational pull. One by one, the survivors drift off into an uneasy rest, heads lolling. He and Sarivia remain awake, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. At some point, she stands and walks to him, footsteps silent on the metal floor. He tenses, a part of him still keyed up, expecting a challenge. She says nothing at first, simply meeting his gaze. Her markings glow softly, reflecting in his eyes. Finally, she speaks in a quiet, measured tone. You saved me more than once. It's not quite gratitude, more a statement of fact. He nods. You did the same. You didn't have to. She cocks her head, studying him. You didn't have to either. They lapse into silence again, that charged pause returning. This time, it's not so easily dismissed. He feels a subtle shift inside him, a seed of something he refuses to name. A clang from the outer hull startles them both. Something scuttles across the top of the crawler, sniffing. They freeze, waiting, ready. The creature moves on, leaving only the fading echo of claws on metal. He exhales shakily, lowering his pistol. She stands so close, the faint subsonic hum of her presence resonating through him again. His voice is a whisper when he breaks the silence. What brought you here, to a place like this? She hesitates, clearly unused to such questions. My people. She trails off, as though searching for the right words. I was cast out. Or I cast myself out. It doesn't matter now. Her markings dim. She looks away, as if the memory pains her. He swallows, not pressing for more. Instead, he looks around at the battered survivors, all huddled in the corners of the crawler. These are my people, he says quietly. But we've turned on each other as much as we've been turned on by your kind. She nods, her expression grim. That's the way of war. No one is innocent. He can't argue. Moments pass in an intimate hush. Neither wants to yield to vulnerability, but something about their shared struggle has made them closer than he could have imagined in such a short time. She settles next to him, resting her back against the cold metal. The flickering light from a cracked overhead panel plays across her horns and the lines of her face. He notices fresh blood on her side, a shallow cut that must have reopened during the battle. Without a word, he rummages in his pack for a small med kit. He gestures for her to let him see. She watches him warily, but relents, shifting her arm to expose the wound. He works quickly, cleaning the gash. She sucks in a sharp breath when the antiseptic stings, claws scraping against the floor. He meets her eyes, a silent apology. She offers no thanks, but her gaze softens, the luminous patterns on her skin reflecting a calmer glow. When he's done, he leans back, exhaustion pooling in his bones. She flexes her arm, testing the bandage. He can feel her eyes on him. The hush that settles is not awkward, but it's thick with unspoken tension. He wonders if she's recalling the moment she held him to his knees. He is. He can't shake the memory of her strong hand gripping his shirt, her breath warm against his face. Something in him stirs, a desire that conflicts with everything else he's ever known. She's an alien, a potential enemy, and yet, he wants to trust her, or at least explore what lies between them. He senses the same conflict in her, the way her markings glow softly every time she looks at him. Her lips part slightly, but she says nothing. Outside, the wind whistles across the wasteland, carrying the distant roars of wandering beasts. Inside, the survivors sleep fitfully, oblivious to the charged atmosphere between him and Sarivia. Finally, he closes his eyes, trying to get some rest, hoping that the nightmares of lost comrades won't haunt him tonight. For a long time, he feels her beside him, awake and alert, as if she's standing guard. He pretends not to notice the faint tremble in his chest every time she shifts closer. When morning, or whatever passes for morning in the ashen sky, comes, they prepare to move on. The survivors stir, rummaging for supplies in the battered remains of the crawler. Sarivia stands apart, scanning the horizon. Dane approaches her, noticing how the tension in her stance returns the moment others are near. She glances at him, then flicks her gaze away. He keeps his voice low. "We'll look for high ground," he says. "Try to signal the dropship." She nods curtly, muttering something under her breath that might be agreement. They set out, picking a path through rubble and ash dunes, the scorching sun hidden behind a veiled sky. Over the hours, they find bits of ammunition, scraps of food. They ward off 2 more creature attacks, each one more draining than the last. The survivors are reaching their limit, and so is he. Only Sarivia seems to maintain that predator's grace, though he catches signs of her weariness in the droop of her shoulders. Eventually, they crest a ridge of collapsed buildings, the skeletal remains of some city or base. Through the haze, he spots the faint outline of a column's tower, half toppled but still rising above the wreckage. It might be their best chance at sending a distress signal. The group trudges toward it. Along the way, they find a crater, the remains of a bombed-out zone. Twisted metal, scorched earth. In the middle of it stands what appears to be a broken override console that once managed the tower's transmissions. Hope stirs among the survivors. They descend into the crater, rummaging through debris. Sarivia stands guard, scanning the perimeter. He glances at her from time to time, noticing the subtle tension in her stance. The air has grown hotter, the stench of chemicals lingering. At last, one of the survivors calls out, a middle-aged woman with a bandaged leg. She's found a power cell, partially intact. If they can jury-rig it to the console, they might get enough juice to broadcast a signal. Dane kneels beside the console, prying it open. Wires spill out like mechanical entrails. He sets to work, connecting leads, hoping against hope. The others form a defensive perimeter. Sarivia prowls the rim of the crater, her luminous eyes scanning the horizon. He finally manages to power up the console. Static hisses from a broken speaker. He tries different frequencies, searching for any open channel. Nothing but static. He ups the power draw from the cell, risking an overload. A burst of squealing noise erupts, then a half-garbled signal. If anyone hears, the console dies. He curses, adjusting wires. Sparks fly, and the cell glows ominously. One more try. Static, a burst of faint words, something about an extraction zone. It's not clear. The cell starts to overheat, hissing. He yanks his hand back before it can burn him. Enough, Sarivia says from behind him. Her tone is urgent. He looks over, seeing her horns silhouetted against the swirling dust. We can't stay here. The creatures will sense the energy spike. His heart sinks. He sees the same despair in the eyes of the exhausted survivors. Even so, he can't give up. Just a few more seconds, he grits out, adjusting the leads again. The console crackles to life once more stable this time. He manages to send out a short distress beacon, hoping the dropship pilot might still be in range. Then the power cell emits a shrill whine, and he flings it away just as it explodes in a burst of sparks and acrid smoke. The console sags, thoroughly fried. They reel from the blast, coughing and blinking. It's not strong enough to harm them severely, but the noise echoes across the silent wasteland. A moment later, they hear answering roars. Creatures are converging. Sarivia grabs his arm, pulling him to his feet. "Move!" she hisses. He doesn't fight her. The group scrambles up the opposite side of the crater, hearts thundering. The roars grow louder, a chattering chorus of fury. He can't see them yet, but the dust clouds swirling in the distance suggest a pack on the move. They half run, half limp across the broken terrain. Every muscle in his body screams for rest, but they have no choice. Sarivia leads, her steps unwavering. He moves behind her, ushering the slower survivors along. More than once, he has to catch someone before they collapse. In the distance, the remains of a metal tower stand precariously. It might offer a vantage point. They race toward it, stumbling over fallen beams and shattered plating. Every second, the roars draw closer, heavy impacts shaking the ground. They finally reach the tower's base, an opening that leads inside. Twisted support beams groan overhead. Sarivia ducks in first, scanning for threats. He and the others follow, forming a defensive circle. This place is hardly safer than the crater. Broken windows let the dust swirl in. The tower leans at a dangerous angle, creaking in the wind. The survivors huddle together, rifles aimed at the entry. The creature's roars echo outside, filling the air with dread. He glances at Sarivia, whose eyes narrow, luminous lines pulsing across her skin. They are cornered again, with nowhere else to go. One of the survivors whimpers. "We can't outrun them." Dane presses his lips together, scanning the tower. A rickety stairwell spirals upward. "We go up," he says. "It might buy us time." They climb, each step precarious. The metal steps shudder under their combined weight. Below, the roars intensify, accompanied by the clang of claws on metal. The creatures are inside. Gunfire erupts from one of the men trailing behind. He shouts a warning. "They're coming!" The survivors open fire, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The beasts swarm up the base of the tower, climbing walls with unnatural agility. Dane and Sarivia exchange a glance. This is it. She motions for him to keep ascending. She'll cover the rear. He hesitates, but one look in her eyes tells him she'll fight best down here. Nodding, he leads the survivors up, forcing them onward. Below, he hears Sarivia's savage battle cries and the screech of dying creatures. The tower groans dangerously with each impact. He pushes the fear down, focusing on getting the survivors to the top. Reaching a landing near the top level, they find an observation room with shattered windows. The wind howls through. He stations the survivors along the edges, rifles ready. A smaller group of creatures is climbing from outside, their claws scraping the metal. He and the others shoot through the windows, trying to slow their advance. From below, he hears Sarivia give a furious shout, and then a thunderous crash. The floor beneath him jolts. He calls out her name, voice raw. No response. More creatures climb, shrieking. The survivors are panicked, nearly out of ammo. He can feel the tower swaying. He fires again and again until his pistol clicks empty. Dropping it with a curse, he picks up a fallen rifle. A hiss draws his attention to the window. A beast is already halfway in. He slams the rifle stock against its head, hearing a crack. It tumbles out, but another takes its place. Then, from somewhere below, a flare of golden light streaks upward. Sarivia appears, leaping onto a crossbeam just outside the observation room. She's battered, her markings blazing fiercely, a savage glow in her eyes. Behind her, the creatures pour up the tower, but she slashes at them with lethal precision. Dane grabs her arm, pulling her through the shattered window before the tower lurches again. Her chest heaves, and for a split second, their eyes lock with overwhelming intensity. It's like everything else falls away. She's alive, and he's never felt such a surge of relief. The moment is cut short as the creatures begin ripping at the supports. The entire tower shudders. Twisted Metal screams in protest. "We have to get out of here!" one of the survivors yells, desperation dripping from every word. Sarivia and Dane exchange a look. If they go back down, they'll be overrun. The outside is swarming. But if the tower collapses, they're done. Sarivia darts to the shattered window on the opposite side, scanning the horizon. Her markings flare. "Look!" she shouts. Far in the distance, a silhouette, possibly a dropship, hovers, coming closer. Maybe the pilot received their partial signal after all. It's not guaranteed they'll survive until it arrives. Dane looks down at the seething mass of creatures. He clenches his teeth. "We hold the line until it lands," he says. The survivors gather at the broken windows, weapons trembling in their hands. Sarivia plants herself near the main opening, claws extended, eyes blazing. One by one, the creatures swarm up. Gunfire rattles. She slices through alien flesh. The tower groans again, chunks of steel raining down. The conflict becomes a blur of muzzle flashes, shrieks, and the acrid tang of blood. A monstrous claw lashes out, catching one of the survivors across the chest. He's ripped away, screaming. Sarivia roars in rage, leaping after the beast, severing its head in a wild slash. Dane reloads, every muscle burning. Time twists, each second an eternity. The creatures keep coming, relentless. Some climb through the windows, forcing brutal close-quarters combat. Sarivia and Dane move in sync, fighting back to back. He sees her luminous markings flicker with every heartbeat, her horns casting fierce shadows as she moves. His breath ragged, he manages to slam a fresh clip into the rifle. Sparks fly overhead as the tower's top portion shears away from the main structure, plunging into the abyss below. The observation room tilts precariously. He hears the pilot's ship engines roaring closer. If they can just hold on a moment longer. Suddenly, the dropship's searchlight sweeps over them, blinding in the gloom. A voice crackles over loudspeakers, telling them to prepare for evac. The pilot hovers dangerously close to the leaning tower. The survivors scramble to the edge, hooking safety lines the pilot drops. The creatures, sensing escape, redouble their attack. Dane fires into the horde, adrenaline blazing. Sarivia slices through limbs and claws, her every motion lethal. One by one, the survivors latch onto the lines, hoisted into the open cargo bay. When it's Dane's turn, he grips the rope, beckoning to Sarivia. She hesitates, scanning the swarming beasts below. "Go!" she snaps. "You first!" He curses but obeys, not wanting to waste precious seconds. As he's lifted away, he keeps his rifle trained on the vantage, covering her. She leaps onto the line just as the tower gives a final tortured groan. A massive chunk of steel collapses, shearing through the lower supports. The entire structure begins to topple. The pilot pushes the engines to the max, pulling up. Sarivia clings to the rope, but a screeching creature latches onto her leg, dragging her down. Dane, already on the cargo ramp, hurls himself forward, half leaning out of the ship. He seizes her arm, bellowing, "Hold on!" She locks eyes with him, her markings flaring in raw desperation. The beast's weight pulls them both downward. The pilot angles the dropship, trying to compensate. With a snarling roar, Sarivia slashes the creature's throat, black ichor spraying. It loosens its grip, plunging into the chaos below. She scrambles up the rope, aided by Dane, until she collapses onto the cargo bay floor. The tower crashes in a deafening cacophony of twisted metal. Dust and debris mushroom into the sky, nearly engulfing them. The dropship veers away, engines straining. Then, as the craft stabilizes, the pilot locks the hatch. The survivors huddle together, trembling with exhaustion and relief. Dane coughs, eyes streaming from the dust. He turns to find Sarivia kneeling on the metal deck, arms braced, her chest heaving. Without thinking, he drops to one knee, resting a hand on her shoulder. She lifts her gaze, and for a moment, it's as if only the two of them exist. Neither speaks. The raw gratitude, the adrenaline, the near-death terror swirl around them. He feels the warmth of her skin through the tears in her suit, the faint tremor still running through her. Her horns cast slender shadows across the cargo bay floor. Slowly, her markings dim to a softer glow, pulsing with a quieter rhythm. He can't deny the overpowering rush of emotion. She saved him, and he saved her, again and again. The pilot calls out from the cockpit that they're leaving the danger zone. The tension in the cabin eases, but it remains between them. One of the soldiers who made it looks on, eyes narrowed at the sight of a human comforting an alien. But he says nothing. The survivors seem too drained to care about differences right now. Dane helps Sarivia to her feet. She sways slightly, but regains her balance, her eyes never leaving his. It's as though she's searching for something in his gaze, confirmation, acceptance, maybe defiance. He gives a short nod, swallowing hard. She draws a trembling breath, her lips parted. The weight of all they've been through lingers between them, shaping the electricity in the air. The flight lasts hours, crossing the blasted landscape below. No one speaks much. The pilot sets them down at a remote outpost that has remained mostly intact. Medics rush out to help the wounded survivors, who stumble away with varying degrees of relief. Dane steps onto the dusty ground, scanning the horizon. Sarivia stands beside him, horns catching the dying light of the sun. She's quiet, taking in the outpost's ragged walls and the guarded stares of the few soldiers present. They look at her with apprehension. But no one raises a weapon. The commanding officer, a weary man with soot-streaked cheeks, greets them, referencing the hasty broadcast from the facility. Supplies are limited, he explains, but they have water and a place to rest. Dane guides Sarivia toward a small yard behind the outpost, hoping to avoid the prying eyes of the soldiers who might consider her an enemy. She stands with her back to a corrugated metal fence, arms crossed. He notices new bruises painting her skin, her horns chipped in places from the battles. The patterns across her body still glow faintly, reflecting her pulse. She watches him approach, no words passing between them. He feels the pressure in his chest again, that same pull. So much tension, so many battles, a constant push and pull for dominance. He closes the distance, stopping a breath away. Her gaze flicks over him, lingering on the fresh scrapes and half-healed bruises that cover his arms. Then it lifts to meet his eyes. He remembers the first command she gave, kneel. He remembers how he resisted, how her voice and presence unsettled him in ways he couldn't control. Now, standing face to face, neither of them moves to attack or retreat. The dust-laden wind tugs at their hair, carrying the echoes of faraway chaos. For a long, taut moment, all he can hear is the pounding of his heart. She lifts a hand, very slowly, curling her fingers into the fabric of his shirt near the collar. It's a mirror of the moment in the corridor when she demanded his submission, but now the context is different. They've saved each other's lives. They've struggled, bled, and nearly died side by side. Her grip is firm, but not painful. He can feel the warmth of her palm through the cloth, can sense the subtle trembling of her breath. He doesn't resist. Instead, he meets her halfway, placing a hand at her waist, his fingertips brushing the edge of her bioluminescent patterns. She exhales, and he hears a faint hitch, as though the tension is finally unraveling. They don't speak. Words would be inadequate. Instead, she moves closer, closing the scant inches between them until their bodies almost touch. He remembers how earlier she had pinged him with that fierce authority in her eyes. Now, there's a softness lurking beneath the steel. There's no gentle lead-up, no uncertain negotiation. Their lips meet in a sudden, raw collision, a melding of hunger and defiance. It's a struggle, intense and almost desperate, as if each tries to claim the other. Her claws grip his shirt tighter, pulling him closer, a low sound vibrating in her throat. He responds with equal fervor, pressing her against the fence, the coarse metal rattling under the force. For a moment, their breath mingles, hearts racing. Her bioluminescent markings glow brighter, a cascade of shifting colors that dance across her skin. His own pulse slams in his veins, driven by both adrenaline and something deeper. It's as if the battles, the near-death experiences, the raw survival have ignited a spark between them that can't be denied. They break apart only to gasp for air, foreheads nearly touching. Her eyes burn with an intensity that makes his blood roar. He can feel the question in her gaze, is this real, or just the aftermath of shared danger? He doesn't have an answer, so he kisses her again, and this time it's slower, but no less charged. He can taste the salt of sweat on her lips, feel the faint quiver in her arms as she holds him. Eventually, they separate, breathing unsteadily. The world around them creeps back into focus. Distant voices, the hum of machinery, the watchful eyes of a soldier or two peeking from around a corner. He steps back, clearing his throat, but he doesn't release her waist. She looks at him with a mix of challenge and acceptance. He realizes he's still gripping her horns as if he's bracing her in place. Carefully, he lowers his hands. She lets her palm drift from his chest to his shoulder, then down his arm. No words pass between them, but everything about that moment feels decisive, like they've crossed a threshold that cannot be undone. They spend the next few hours helping fortify the outpost. He organizes salvage teams, ensuring the survivors have medical attention. She moves quietly among them, offering to stand guard. Some soldiers look at her with fear or suspicion, but as time passes and she helps repel a minor attack from a wandering beast, they begin to grudgingly accept her presence. Whenever Dane and Sarivia cross paths, tension sparks, a reminder of what happened behind the fence. But they don't display it openly in front of the others. Night falls, and the outpost's floodlights illuminate the battered perimeter. The wind carries the stench of distant fires, and the sky remains bruised with ash. Dane finds a relatively quiet corner by a stack of supply crates. He's rechecking his rifle when he senses movement behind him. He turns, finding her watching. Her eyes reflect the floodlights, glowing like embers. She approaches, footsteps nearly silent on the packed dirt. Without a word, she crouches beside him, glancing at the rifle. He notices her bandaged side, the bloodstains no longer fresh. Slowly, she reaches out, brushing her fingertips along the barrel of his weapon, then lifting her gaze to him. He reads the silent question in her eyes. Are you always so guarded? I've fought a long time, he admits quietly. Lost a lot. She doesn't pry. Instead, she nods in understanding. He sees the flicker of sorrow in her markings. She, too, carries burdens she hasn't shared. They're kindred in that unspoken pain. Her hand shifts from the rifle to his shoulder, a gentle press that feels shockingly intimate. He sets the gun aside, exhaling slowly. His heart thuds with the same intensity he feels whenever they're this close. She leans in, her horns framing her face in the stark light, her eyes searching his. The faint vibration of her presence hums in his ears. He can't look away. Their next kiss is different from the earlier frenzy, infused with a strange tenderness that neither expected. The moment lingers in the dusty darkness, overshadowing the gloom of their surroundings. It's as though the exhaustion, the heartbreak, the fear have crystallized into a fierce longing for each other. Her hand slides behind his neck, claws lightly scraping. He savors the jolt it sends through his system, matching her fervor with his own. When they break apart, her forehead rests lightly against his. The rawness in her gaze reflects something he feels, too. This connection is more than just the aftermath of shared danger. They spend the night in snatches of restless sleep, always ready for an alarm that might never come. At dawn, a battered human transport arrives, carrying reinforcement troops and a new commanding officer. It seems someone, somewhere, is re-establishing a chain of command. The outpost bustles with activity. The commander, a stern-faced man with a prosthetic arm, surveys the area. He takes note of Sarivia and frowns, but he doesn't move against her, not when so many speak of her role in saving them. Instead, he demands a briefing. Dane explains the meltdown, the creatures, and their narrow escape. Sarivia stands beside him, silent. The commander nods grimly, focusing on the strategic ramifications. They're ordered to hold the outpost for a time, to prepare for a push towards safer territory. Sarivia is officially recognized as a cooperative alien asset. It's an uneasy truce, but it's a victory of sorts. Over the next days, they help rebuild defenses, train the remaining survivors, and plan for the larger exodus. Dane and Sarivia's relationship evolves in stolen glances and brief, charged encounters. They don't broadcast their bond to others, but it's there, undeniable. His men notice the tension, the closeness. Some tease him behind his back, others eye her with suspicion. Either of them cares much. Late one night, after an exhausting patrol, he finds her gazing at the horizon, where flickers of distant lightning illuminate the scorched landscape. Without a word, he steps up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. She doesn't turn. For a long moment, they simply stand, side by side, breathing in the smell of dust and ozone. She breaks the silence first. "When I told you to kneel," she murmurs, "I thought you were just another enemy." He huffs a laugh that holds no real humor. "So did I." She glances at him, eyes reflecting the faint luminescence of her markings. "Do you regret anything?" He considers, remembering the fleeting moment in the corridor when her hand clutched his shirt, the raw look in her eyes when he saved her from the creature's jaws, and that first desperate kiss behind the fence. "No," he says, voice low. "Not this." She nods, the corner of her mouth quirking. "I suppose I don't either." They stand in companionable silence, her body warmth radiating against him. Outside the outpost walls, the beasts still roam, and the war still rages, but within the circle they share, a fragile peace has taken hold. Morning finds them preparing for the largest push out of the danger zone. Crates of weapons and supplies are loaded onto transport carriers. Civilians who survived are helped aboard. Soldiers stand guard, scanning the horizon for any sign of another swarm. Dane confers with the commander, mapping out routes to safer territory. Sarivia, upon noticing a group of frightened refugees, moves among them quietly, offering calm words in her low, vibrating voice. Some shy away, but many offer grateful nods. Even though her appearance is alien, they sense her goodwill. He watches her, a strange feeling tugging at his chest, a warmth he hasn't felt in a long time. When the convoy finally departs, it's a risk-laden journey across miles of hostile terrain. Creatures, rogue militias, and the remnants of other alien forces roam unchecked. But they have no choice. Dane mans one of the transports, eyes constantly on the horizon. Sarivia joins him, her posture always alert. They're tense, expecting an ambush at any turn. Hours pass in cautious travel. A few skirmishes break out, quickly quelled. The hush that follows is thick with anticipation. The deeper they go, the more battered the landscape becomes. Craters, overturned vehicles, skeletons of old cities. He sneaks glances at Sarivia. She meets his gaze once or twice, a silent acknowledgement that they're in this together. By sundown, they near an old fortress rumored to have been an evacuation hub. It's perched atop a cliff overlooking a desert of ash. The commander's scouts report that the area is mostly clear of hostiles, though no promises can be made. Exhausted, the convoy sets up camp outside the fortress walls. Fires are lit, tents erected. Soldiers form a perimeter. Dane and Sarivia help where they can. Finally, with the night wind howling, they find a secluded spot near a half-collapsed tower. He stands behind her, arms circling her waist, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. She leans into him, exhaling a weariness that runs to her core. They don't speak, and they don't need to. By the next morning, the fortress is deemed secure enough to house the refugees temporarily. The soldiers fan out, searching for operational comms equipment. The plan is to call for reinforcements and fully stabilize the region. Despite the chaos, there's a sense of hope among the survivors. Dane can't remember the last time he felt genuine optimism. He glances at Sarivia, who has become an unlikely pillar of support. She catches his eye, and a faint smile touches her lips, an expression he's still getting used to seeing on her. By midday, they've located a functioning long-range transmitter. The commander, with Dane's help, broadcasts coordinates for any Allied forces. While they wait for a response, supplies are rationed, and patrols are sent out to secure the perimeter. Dane takes a moment to check on Sarivia. He finds her near the courtyard, instructing a small group on how to spot creatures before they attack. She demonstrates a quick slash, her horns glinting in the sun. The onlookers watch with a mixture of awe and fear. He stands aside, arms folded, absorbing the sight. She moves like a dancer, every muscle precise, her voice carrying an undercurrent of authority. When she finishes, she notices him. Their eyes lock. He inclines his head, a silent compliment. She comes over, a sheen of sweat on her brow. He offers her a canteen of water. She takes it, pausing to sip. Her markings flare slightly, a subtle pulse. He wonders how much of her attraction is biological, pheromones or subsonic vibrations, and how much is just the raw connection forged in battle. Perhaps it no longer matters. "You staying out of trouble?" he asks, a hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. She arches a brow. "I might ask the same of you." The corners of his mouth turn up. "Not likely," he admits. Then an alarm rings out across the fortress. They whip around, scanning for the source. Scouts rush in, breathless. Another wave of creatures is incoming. A large cluster, heading straight for the fortress. Dane curses under his breath. "Of course," he mutters. They dash to the walls, joining the soldiers who scramble into defensive positions. The refugees are ushered into the lower levels. Within minutes, the horizon darkens with the silhouette of a stampeding horde, dozens, maybe hundreds, too many to count. Fear knots his stomach. Even with the fortress walls, they are outnumbered. Sarivia stands on the parapet, the wind catching her hair. Her markings glow, surging as adrenaline floods her system. She glances at Dane, her gaze unwavering. He steps beside her, rifle at the ready. "Ready?" he asks, though the question is half rhetorical. She answers with a grim nod. "Let them come." The horde slams against the walls with a force that rattles the entire structure. The soldiers open fire from the battlements. Some creatures scale the stone with their claws, others try to burst through the gates. It's chaos, a deafening cacophony of roars, gunshots, and screams. He and Sarivia move in tandem along the wall, blasting creatures off the ledge. Twice she nearly topples from the parapet, only for him to seize her arm and yank her back. Another time, a creature lunges at him from behind, but she's there, claws raking across its skull. Smoke from spent rounds and plasma charges billows around them. The fortress groans under the onslaught. But the defenders hold strong, spurred on by desperation. For hours, the battle rages. Just when they think the horde might be thinning, a new wave appears. Dane feels exhaustion drag at his limbs. Sweat drips into his eyes, stinging. He glances at Sarivia. She's covered in blood and dust, panting, but her eyes blaze with indomitable resolve. Near the gates, a section of wall collapses, sending stone and rubble cascading into the courtyard. A surge of creatures floods in. Dane curses, rushing down the steps with a squad of soldiers. Sarivia bounds ahead of him, horns slicing through the dust. They form a desperate line, turning the courtyard into a killing ground. The creatures are monstrous, spider-like in some cases, reptilian in others. This time, Sarivia's claws alone aren't enough. She seizes a fallen spear-like weapon from a dead soldier, and hurls it through the skull of a massive beast that tries to crush them. Dane empties a clip into another, black ichor spraying across broken cobblestones. The fight drags on, a brutal test of endurance. Gradually, the creatures thin out. The survivors push them back, each kill costing them precious energy. Finally, a piercing horn blast from the battlements signals that the horde is retreating. The few remaining beasts scuttle away, snarling. The courtyard is a slaughterhouse of corpses, both human and alien. The fortress stands, but barely. Smoke and dust swirl in the aftermath. Dane collapses to a knee, panting. Sarivia sinks down beside him, equally spent. A hush falls, broken only by the moans of the injured and the distant rumble of retreating creatures. Medics scramble, triaging wounds. The commander limps over, battered but alive. He nods, eyes filled with weary relief. We held, he rasps. Dane grits his teeth, swallowing the taste of copper. He glances at Sarivia, her horns flecked with dried gore, her eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. Her markings dim, flickering like a dying flame. She meets his gaze, her expression unreadable but for the faint curve of her lips. Somehow they've survived again. In the days that follow, reinforcements finally arrive. The Allied forces, responding to that partial signal, sweep in to secure the region. Gunships scatter the remaining creatures. The fortress becomes a staging ground for the eventual reclaiming of the entire sector. Sarivia's role in the defense does not go unnoticed. Though some remain wary, others regard her with gratitude or even admiration. Dane, now recognized by the new command structure, is offered a position leading scouting expeditions. He accepts, on one condition: Sarivia is free to come and go, recognized for her contributions. At last, after what feels like a lifetime of bloodshed, a measure of peace settles. Or at least, the war recedes to a distant horizon. He stands on the fortress ramparts one evening, watching the setting sun break through the ash-laden clouds, casting gold and crimson streaks across the sky. Sarivia approaches, her footsteps light. She comes to a stop beside him, resting her hands on the warm stone. The breeze tugs at her hair, and her horns frame her face like a crown of bone. For a while, they just watch the sun together, letting the colors wash over them. He senses her shifting, turning slightly toward him. He looks at her, and the intensity in her gaze makes his heart pound all over again. She lifts a hand, brushing her knuckles against his cheek. He closes his eyes at the contact, remembering every battle, every clash, every moment they thought would be their last. When he opens them, she's studying him with a softness he never would have imagined in the woman. No, the alien, who first commanded him to kneel at her feet. He covers her hand with his, leaning into the touch. The unspoken question in her eyes is answered by the steady thud of his pulse. Yes, he thinks. This is real. She leans in, pressing her forehead to his. Their breath mingles. There's no rush this time, no frantic desperation. Just two battered souls finding solace in each other. He remembers how unstoppable she looked when she demanded his submission. Now, he realizes the power dynamic was never about true dominance. It was about survival, about testing boundaries. They've moved beyond that. Whatever they share now, it's equal parts ferocity and tenderness. He dips his head, catching her lips in a kiss that feels more like a promise than a collision. Her arms slide around his shoulders, and his hands settle at her waist. They stand there, lost in each other, as the sun descends. When they part, her luminous markings glow with a quiet, steady pulse. They don't make vows, don't speak declarations. They don't need to. The next day will bring whatever challenges it may, further battles, complicated alliances, lingering prejudices. But their bond is forged in blood and tempered by fire. They've passed every test, saved each other's lives, and surrendered to a deeper connection that transcends their initial hostility. The fortress might stand as a testament to their victory, but the real proof lies in the way they look at each other, the way neither flinches from the other's touch anymore. When the final supply carrier arrives, bearing a new wave of relief troops and engineers, it's clear that this chapter of chaos is drawing to a close. Dane oversees the unloading of crates, giving orders to the men. Sarivia stands nearby, arms folded. He catches her eye, and she offers a slight nod, a wordless acknowledgement of how far they've come. A soldier approaches them, uncertain, and hands them each a data pad with official recognition, instructing them to check in at command for further orders. Dane thanks him. The soldier nods respectfully at Sarivia, still wary, but no longer hostile. In the courtyard, the scorched ground is already being cleared. Debris is piled high for disposal. Life goes on. He watches the sun climb higher, and Sarivia steps close, the hum of her presence settling over him like a protective mantle. They pause in the center of the courtyard, survivors and soldiers bustling around them. Neither speaks, but their gazes lock. In that unspoken moment, a surge of understanding passes between them. They have found something that neither expected and both refuse to lose. He reaches for her hand, and this time, she lets him thread his fingers through hers. She doesn't release his grip or snap a warning. Instead, she holds on, her claws gently resting against his skin. A passing officer gives them a curious glance but says nothing. The fortress walls cast long shadows, a reminder of the battles fought. Yet within those shadows, two figures stand side by side, bound by a connection no longer defined by fear or hatred. Their story might continue in another place, under different circumstances, but for now, they are together, having reached a hard-won and definitive peace in each other's arms. They walk toward the main gate, where the path leads away from the fortress and into the rebuilt lands beyond. Each step resonates with the memory of conflict and the promise of something greater. The wind sweeps across the courtyard, stirring the dust in gentle swirls around their feet. He glances at her, and she meets his gaze, a subtle smile curving her lips. This is not a cliffhanger. This is the end of one journey and the true beginning of something else, something forged in the fires of war and tempered by the fierce, undeniable pull of a love either could have predicted. They leave behind the echo of battles, the broken corridors, and the demands for submission. Kneeling is no longer a question of power. It is a memory of the moment they first collided, a testament to how far they've come from that war-torn corridor to this place of quiet resolution. Under the vast, ash-cleared sky, they walk forward together, hand in hand, as survivors look on. And in that final, decisive moment, there is no doubt, they have won their right to stand side by side, equal parts chaos and harmony, soldier and alien, a bond that neither bullet nor claw can break.